have to, instead of advocating for the rights of Palestinians, instead of organizing lectures and film screenings and whatever other activities, they have to spend time defending themselves, defending the right to even do that. So it's very time intensive, it's very resource intensive, it's very emotionally draining to have to constantly respond to attacks against you. So I want to show just a short video kind of interviewing a few students and scholars in this situation, just to give you a sense of what it's like for people doing this work.
As an activist with Students for Justice in Palestine at NYU, I've been called many things, including a self-hating Jew, anti-Semitic.
I was called a member of Al-Qaeda, I was called a terrorist, I was called many racial slurs.
After the American Studies Association passed the resolution to support the academic boycott of Israeli universities, we were the subject of a tsunami of onslaughts.
My career was destroyed because of gross mischaracterizations of my tweets critical of the Israeli government. I lost my home, I lost my income.
Unfortunately, despite all the human rights work we did at NYU, a lot of us, myself included, feel like publicly we have to hide this activism because of these rumors and these accusations that have been leveled against us.
I edited my resume to remove SJP. I made sure it wasn't on my LinkedIn. I tried to limit how much of it was on Facebook.
It did have the effect of making students hesitant to join SJP or to support Palestine solidarity work.
Administration at Loyola often subjected members of Students for Justice in Palestine to FBI-style interrogations, which lasted hours.
An administrator, usually some sort of middle-tier bureaucrat, who smiles at us and tells us this isn't about us, but it's just standard policy. Even though we all organize with different groups and have never experienced that with those groups.
It was actually my involvement with SJP that led me to being denied from my homeland, Palestine, by Israel.
They forced us to pay a large sum of money for security guards, which were completely unnecessary.
I actually haven't heard of any other group that had to have security at every single event that they host.
You go to an SJP event, and because the administration, I think, is so nervous about what's going to happen, you have to go through a metal detector. You have to, well, first you have to sign up in advance and reserve a spot online. Then you have to go through a security check. I mean, it's like you're at Kennedy Airport.
No other club in College of Staten Island has ever been treated that way. Ever.
I always imagined college to be that one space that you were allowed to grow and thrive in academia and activism, kind of figure out, who you are and what you stand for. So when we all, were working towards what we stood for and then we're being isolated for it, it was very shocking because that was, the complete opposite of what I imagined a university campus would be like.
Gives you a bit of a sense of the effect that it has on individuals, on students who aren't really expecting this kind of reaction to what ought to be, what students do, the kind of activism that they expect to engage in at college. I want to just give you a couple of examples of some cases that really illustrate what is going on here. I'm sure many of you have heard about Steven Saraita. How many? Everybody? Good. You know, Steve's case is one of the most extreme that we've heard about recently. We're talking about a tenured professor going to the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. This was in the summer of 2014 when the attacks on Gaza were happening. And he's active on Twitter. He's you know, a big commentator on social media. And he was outraged, and he was tweeting his outrage about the children being killed and what was happening. And there was a campaign to get the university to fire him. He was, you know, he had just gotten this job. He was moving with his family. He had gotten a daycare for his son. The books were ordered for his classes. The students were registered for their classes. And although the university initially defended his right to engage in this extracurricular speech, they ultimately bowed to the pressure of Israel advocacy groups and donors who said, you know, this is anti-Semitic. This is threatening to, we don't want our children going to this school and you know, having this professor on campus. And so they fired him. They terminated his position. And he sued. The Center for Constitutional Rights represented him. And he sued the university. And you know, the case settled, but his career has been totally derailed. He's now at the American University in Beirut, but it's possible that he'll never again have a tenured position in the United States. So the effect is real, and this is, you know, an established scholar who's very well respected and whose students love him. You know, you heard from Ahmed about what happened at Fordham. We've heard this many times. Students their applications for SJP being delayed, their requests to have events delayed and canceled, and all kinds of bureaucratic barriers being erected to prevent them from organizing. But this is one of the most egregious cases we've seen. And this was a situation where we really couldn't just let the university get away with it. If Fordham is able to ban SJP from their campus, other universities will think they can do it too. So we had to step in and file a lawsuit against Fordham, and hopefully that will be successful, and we will get SJP instated. You know, the law and litigation, there's just no guarantee, as all of the lawyers in the room can attest. This isn't, you know, guaranteed to succeed. But our philosophy is that the law isn't the answer. The law isn't the only or best tool. It is one of many tools. And so Ahmed and his fellow students and organizations that support them have been putting a lot of pressure on the university. Church groups are writing letters. Clergy are writing letters to the university. There are protests. There is media attention. We're getting media attention to this case. And that is as important, not just to help the case succeed, but to educate the public about what's going on and to show how unfair and how blatant this Palestine exception is. This is these are posters that appeared on campuses across the country. They tried to link SJP to Hamas. It's supposed to be a recruitment poster. Do you want to show your support for Hamas terrorists whose stated goal is the elimination of the Jewish people and the Jewish state? Join us, Students for Justice in Palestine. It names individual students and professors who support Palestine generally. You know, we got calls from students around the country worried about these posters and about having their names smeared in this way. And we've appealed to a number of universities to respond appropriately to these kinds of attacks. One student who responded, who was listed in this UCLA poster, wrote an op-ed in a student paper about who David Horowitz is. And this is a man who the Southern Poverty Law Center has deemed engages in hate speech and is a hate monger. And what happens? He gets a letter from David Horowitz threatening to sue him. So we advised the student along the way, and it was clearly a baseless threat. But imagine what it's like to get that kind of letter in the mail as a student who is just speaking your mind. Legislation. Beyond campuses, we work around the country to combat other ways that Palestine advocacy is being challenged. So right now we're in a situation where legislatures around the country are introducing and passing bills that target BDS specifically and Palestine advocacy more generally. We have here a law in New Jersey that Chris Christie passed last year that requires the state to divest its pension funds from companies that boycott Israel. And we have other states where the state isn't allowed to contract with companies that boycott Israel. There are bills being introduced that try to introduce a definition of anti-Semitism that would encompass basically any criticism of Israel. Anything that delegitimizes or demonizes or is a double standard against Israel would be anti-Semitic under this definition. You can imagine that that includes any and all criticism of Israel. So to give you a sense of the scale of this problem, the legislative attack, we saw at least 38 legislative measures in 2016 introduced targeting BDS, and 17 of these became law. So far this year, we've seen about 30 bills introduced. So just in 4 months, we've seen almost as many bills introduced as last year. What are we up against? Who's behind all this? I think we're in a moment now where the lines are clearer and clearer. We have somebody like Trump in the White House. We have Steve Bannon in the White House, and they're allied very clearly with Sheldon Adelson was Trump's top donor. He also donates to David Horowitz, who is responsible for those posters I showed you. And we know that David Horowitz is very friendly with Steve Bannon, so it comes full circle. These folks like David Horowitz, who are considered pretty fringe and far right, have the ear of the White House. That means that things are very likely going to get worse. And the administration has said that they're going to send the DOJ to campuses to investigate what's happening around Palestine advocacy. So even though we're beginning to see a break, some polarization within the Jewish community and in mainstream politics with things like the Iran deal, with Bernie Sanders kind of beginning to speak out on this issue, this is still very much an issue where there's complete bipartisanship, like no other issue. Support for Israel is almost across the board what we see in the political sphere. And the resources behind it are astounding. Dozens of Israel advocacy groups with tens and tens of millions of dollars behind them. From the State of Israel, from donors like Sheldon Adelson, dealing with budgets of in the millions. And a big part of this strategy is really legal. With these virtually limitless resources, these groups are relying on frivolous lawsuits and on their power in legislatures to target Palestine advocacy And this falls most heavily on Arabs, on Muslims, who are already targeted by this administration and in the society more generally. They know that these legal battles take a lot of resources to fight, they take a lot of energy, and they have a huge emotional toll on a mostly grassroots movement that we're talking about here. Funnily, our opposition has said that we're building a war chest and that we're engaging in lawfare against them. I think if you just have a visual here of the difference in resources that we're dealing with, that's so laughable. This is just a fraction of, in red, what our opposition, the resources our opposition has. One Hillel chapter has 20 employees at Columbia University, and we have 6 to serve the country. Our budget this year is $750,000. So what do we do? What does Palestine Legal do to fight back? We've become the first line of defense against attacks on activists. We get calls every day for legal advice and representation. We engage in policy campaigns around legislation and other policy attempts to target Palestine advocacy. We engage the media to get these stories out. We track incidents and we expose the trends that we're seeing, as we did in our report that Abed mentioned. And then we do education around this. We do Know Your Rights workshop with activist groups around the country so that we can get ahead of what's happening, so that people know their rights and know how to respond to these issues. So our representation work, just to give you a couple of examples. We represented Paul Hedwig. He's a student at UC Berkeley. He